I shot this once. Let's shoot it again, this time with the microphone on. What's up, guys? It is the 12th of July, 2019, 9:30 in the morning. I am currently uploading the Week 14 review draft that I shot last night. But before this second half of the season kicks off, I wanted to go ahead and have another mid-season video that I usually do in written form. And that's a mid-season review of the team with the most roster moves, and this year it is Frank Bucco. What I'm going to do is start with each one of his picks from the draft, 1 to 25, and map out every single move that he's made that has built the roster he has currently. As well, I'll also count the 2 DL spots and the NA spot that opened up 3 other roster spots. So theoretically, it's 28 roster spots total. Let's get this thing underway. Chris Sale, he drafted number 1 overall. He traded him for Jose Ramirez, who he traded for Julio Teheran. So Chris Sale becomes Julio Teheran. Second round pick was Javi Baez. He traded him for JD Martinez. Third round pick was Juan Soto. He traded him for Merrill Kelly, who he dropped for Brian McCann, who he dropped for Robinson Chirinos, who he dropped for Christian Vasquez. Juan Soto becomes Christian Vasquez. Number 4 was Blake Treinen, who he traded for Carlos Correa. Number 5, Mitch Haniger. He dropped for Colin Moran, who he dropped for Adrian Drianza, who he dropped outright. Number 6 was Nick Castellanos, and is the only guy left from the draft in May that is still on Frank's roster. Much like Frank's fantasy football team this past year, where the kicker was the only guy who stuck around, Nick Castellanos is the kicker of this baseball team. Number 7 was Matt Olson. He dropped him for Brandon Belt, who he dropped for Kendrys Morales, who he dropped for Mark Canha, who he dropped for Frankie Montas, who would have stayed on the team had Frankie Montas not done PEDs, so he dropped him for Kyle Ryan. Number 8 was Buster Posey. Dropped him for Mitch Garver, dropped him for Merrill Kelly, dropped him for Chase Anderson, dropped him for Hunter Pence, dropped him for Francisco Liriano, dropped him for Chris Davis, dropped him for Josh Tomlin, who he dropped for Chris Davis, who he dropped for Danny Santana, who he dropped for Rowdy Tellez, dropped Tellez for Chatwood for Pierce for Kyle Crick for Marwin Gonzalez for Aaron Bummer for Freddie Galvis for Marcus Walden for Ryan McMahon, who he traded for Jake Odorizzi. Number 9 is Mike Foltynewicz. Mike Foltynewicz was dropped for Felix Pena for Ryan Stanek for Scooter Gennett for Noe Ramirez for Heath Henry. Number 10, Kyle Freeland traded John Lester for Chris Bryant. Number 11, Matt Strom dropped him for Brian McCann, dropped McCann for Hunter Dozier. Number 12, Justin Upton dropped him for Scott Kingery, dropped Kingery for Marwin Gonzalez for Flowers for Christian Vasquez for Flowers for Vasquez. 4 straight moves back and forth between those 2 catchers. Come on, man. Dropped Vasquez for Zunino for Brebbia for Mike Morin for Chatwood, and Chatwood for Joe Musgrove. Number 13, Ben Zobrist for Bodie for Hanser Alberto for Javi Guerra for Liriano for Todd Frazier for Chris Taylor for Ryan Yarbrough for Delino DeShields for Adrianza for Brian Anderson for Garrett Cooper for Willie Adames was traded for Austin Meadows. Number 14, Alex Wood is traded for Adam Wainwright for Brian Johnson for Mike Soroka for Michael Chavis for Billy Hamilton for Marwin Gonzalez for Mitch Garver for David Bodie for Gio Urshela for Will Harris, and Will Harris for Eliezer Hernandez, and Eliezer Hernandez was dropped outright. Number 15, Jeremy Jeffress for Eduardo Nunez. Nunez for Tyler Naquin. Naquin for Dwight Smith Jr. Smith Jr. for Brian Anderson. Anderson for Nick Whitgren. Whitgren for Brebbia. Brebbia for Molly. Molly for Adamas. Adamas for Urshela. Urshela for Jacob Stallings. Stallings for Hunter, who's a reliever, I think. And Hunter for JT Chargois. 16 is Seth Lugo. Lugo was traded for Kevin Gausman. Gausman for Bader. Bader for Mitch Moreland. Moreland for Jake Marisnick. Marisnick for Zach Plesac. Plesac for Drew Pomeranz. And Pomeranz for not Shane Green, Chad Green. Number 17, Wade LeBlanc. LeBlanc for Ian Kennedy. Kennedy for Albert Pujols. Pujols for Brandon Dixon. Dixon for Felix Hernandez. Hernandez for Shed Long. Shed Long for Ivan Nova. And Ivan Nova was dropped to make room in the Jonathan Scope trade. Number 18, Yohan Camargo. Camargo for Colton Wong. Wong for Trevor Gott. Gott for Jake Diekman. Diekman for Brian Anderson. Anderson for Jeffrey Rodriguez. Rodriguez for Harrison Bader. Bader for Ariel Jurado. And Jurado was traded for Alex Gordon. Number 19, Joey Wendell. Wendell for Christian Vasquez. Vasquez for Josh Fegley. Fegley for Mitch Garver. Garver for Eric Thames. Thames for Vinny Velasquez. Velasquez for Amir Garrett. Garrett for David Fletcher. Fletcher for Gutierrez, that third baseman from Kansas City who he had for like a day and a half. Gutierrez for Domingo Santana. Santana was traded for Steven Matz. Matz was dropped for Manny Margot, and Manny Margot for Miguel Rojas. Number 20, Wade Miley. Miley for... That's not Joe Smith. Caleb Smith, maybe? Not sure. Smith for Jackie Bradley Jr. Jackie Bradley Jr. for Ryan Harper. Ryan Harper for Austin Dio. Austin Dio for Taylor Clark. Clark for Chad Green. Green for Arias. And Arias for Cam Bedrosian, who was outright dropped. Number 21, Brandon Crawford. Crawford for Biagini. Biagini for Adam Morgan. Adam Morgan for Jorge Soler. And Soler for John Gray. Clay Buchholz, number 22, is dropped for Roenis Elias, who's dropped for Gerard Dyson, who's dropped for David Bodie, who's dropped for Andrew Kashner, who's dropped for Jorge Soler. Number 23, Hernan Perez, dropped for Jason Hayward, who was dropped for Gerard Dyson, who's dropped for Greg Garcia, who was dropped for Mike Leake. Leake for Justin Smoke for Brian Johnson for Matt Adams, maybe? Matt Adams for Eliezer Hernandez. Hernandez for Adam Frazier for Ryan Harper. Harper for Reyes Moronta for Brian Anderson. Anderson for Austin Bryce, who is still on the roster. Number 24, Yonder Alonso, dropped for Daniel Hudson. Hudson for Robert Stevenson. Stevenson for Brian Anderson. Anderson for Griffin Canning. Canning for Austin Riley, who was traded for Marcus Stroman. Number 25, Eduardo Nunez, dropped for Teoscar Hernandez, who was dropped for Dansby Swanson, who was dropped for Tim Beckham, who was dropped for Marwin Gonzalez, who was dropped for Ryan Harper, dropped for Roenis Elias, who was dropped for Trevor Gott, who was dropped for Mark Canna, who was dropped for Martin Perez, who was dropped for Merrill Kelly, who's still on the roster. First DL spot was Carlos Gonzalez, dropped for Dan Vogelbach, who was dropped for Kevin Pillar, who was dropped for Eric Sogard, who was dropped for Sam Gaviglio, who was dropped for Glenn Sparkman, who was dropped for Martin Perez, who was dropped for Brandon Kinsler. Second DL spot, Teoscar Hernandez, dropped for Hector Neris, who was traded for Marco Gonzalez, who was dropped for Nick Whitgren, dropped for Yohan Lopez, dropped for Kevin Pillar, who was dropped for Ryan Harper. And finally, the NA spot opened up a spot for Greg Holland. Holland for Ian Kennedy. Kennedy for Yangervis Solarte. Solarte for Junior Guerra. Guerra for Martin Perez. Perez for Aaron Bummer. Bummer for Randall Grichuk. Grichuk for John Gray. Gray for Eric Lauer. Lauer for Harold Ramirez. Ramirez for Adrian Hauser. And Hauser for the currently DL'd Danny Salazar. 180-something moves this time by, and it got him all the way to last place. Frank, hopefully you've learned something from all of these. Hopefully you've learned patience, and hopefully you've learned trade value, because a couple of these trades, you made trades, and the guy you traded away is still on the other guy's roster, and the guy you traded for, you dropped. That happened 3 different times with Merrill Kelly, Steven Matz, and Marco Gonzalez. Perhaps those weren't exactly well-advised trades. Guys, until next time, this has been real, it's been fun, and it's always real fun in the bigs. I'll catch you soon.